and welcome to the third installment of the Beware the Day podcast. My name is Ryan, and thank you for tuning in today. I say this every week. There's over 5 million podcasts in the podcast universe and 70 million subscribers. So I'm honored that you chose this podcast today. The purpose of this podcast primarily is to educate and inform and occasionally entertain. Um, the podcast, where does the title of this podcast come from? It comes from a Langston Hughes poem called Warning. And if you go to Google and you pull that poem up, it's very short. And if you read that, it may sound like a call to arms, but I disagree. I believe that poem is a heads up to our community, telling the enemy that if we are allowed or if we pursue our greatest potential as a people, nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, can stop us. So go take a look at that at your leisure. Um, I want to thank the sponsor of this podcast, and that sponsor is yours truly. So I do not have a sponsor as of yet, so I'm sponsoring this podcast myself. So when I'm not sitting in front of the camera talking to you, I'm a business consultant full time, and as a business consultant, my job is to go into any business and increase that business's profitability and cash flow. Now, what is this? How does all of this tie into generational wealth? Well, I know for a fact, well, I learned this week that 93% of Americans, of working Americans, have some type of side gig or side hustle. Now, why would somebody take on a side gig or side hustle? Primarily, it's to make ends meet financially due to the rising cost of goods and services. So, I'm talking to that 93% right now. Generational wealth begins by making a decision, and that decision is, are you prepared to leave your 9 to 5 and pursue generational wealth full time for yourself and your family? Well, getting back to what I do for a living, um, Accounting 101 will tell you that in order for a business to increase profitability and cash flow, they have to either raise their prices or cut their expenses or do a combination of both. Well, there's a third way to bring cash flow into a business. And that's something that I'd like to share with you. So if you reach out to me, you email me asking for details on this opportunity, and it's not what you think. Um, you've never heard of this because I just learned about it less than 30 days ago. So reach out to me. I want to take this journey with you. And who knows, maybe 6 months from now, you can kiss that 9 to 5 goodbye and get on the road to generational wealth. Now, why is this important? Well, I think it's important because 40 hours of your week is being tied up. If we were able to free up that 40 hours, think of what a difference you can make in your community. You could become a full-time change agent for your community. You could start a podcast. You could start a blog. You could become a community activist and be the change that your community so desperately needs. But if we're giving 40 hours a week to the man, we don't have the time or the energy. They say, well, there's a meeting tonight at church about voter registration. You've been working 8 hours a day. You're not going to anybody's meeting to talk about voter registration. But if you get rid of that job, that 9 to 5, and let's face it, many of you out there absolutely despise the thought of Monday morning, just makes you sick to your stomach. You don't want to go to work on Monday. So let's get rid of that 9 to 5. So if we get rid of that 9 to 5, that frees up 40 hours a week of your time to be a change agent in your community. You can join me on this journey. So if that interests some of you, please reach out and I'll be more than happy to share this opportunity with you. Now, let's get to our history lesson for today. Now, last week we covered quite a bit of information. Just to kind of recap, I gave you some statistics. We talked about income versus wealth. We talked about uh, what with what we do as a people when it comes to passing wealth down to the next generation, and how European Americans average much more when it comes down to passing to inheritance and passing wealth from one generation to the next. We also talked about Black buying power. Black households total approximately $835 billion. That was in 2019. So consumer expenditures in the Black community today top 1.034 trillion. That's TRILLION. So in 2024, consumer expenditures will top $1.03 trillion. Then, so we talked about where we are today when it comes to generational wealth. And then we started our history lesson. We talked about how public policy basically is responsible for the wealth gap between European Americans and African Americans. We talked about Black wealth prior to the Civil War. We also talked about some laws that were put in place to protect Black people and to give them the rights that European Americans enjoy as a result of their birth. But of course, nearly everything that we have to fight for. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866, we did an in-depth study of that. We also talked about the Civil Rights Act of 1870. And we also talked about the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Now, I may have mentioned last week that we were going to talk about the golden age of Black capitalism, but we're going to save that for a future podcast. More than likely, we're going to touch on that next week. Today, we're going to talk about Sherman's Special Field Order, and we're going to talk about the Freedmen's Bureau and the Compromise of 1877 and the end of Reconstruction. I want you to think for a moment about where would we be as a people if the powers that be had allowed Reconstruction to continue instead of ending it with the Compromise of 1877. We're gonna explore that when we get to talking about the Freedmen's Bureau and Reconstruction. So let's start our discussion today with Sherman's Special Field Order number 15. Now, what was Sherman's Special Field Order number 15? Well, who was Sherman? Sherman was a Union general. You may have recalled in school learning about Sherman's March to the Sea, where General Sherman, in what can be described as the most decisive tactical maneuver that brought an end to the Civil War, was Sherman's March to the Sea, where he literally burned the South to the ground. And that's what basically brought the traitorous Confederacy to their knees, which furthered the end of the Civil War. So Sherman's March to the Sea. So we can thank General William Tecumseh Sherman for that. So in addition to burning the South to the ground and bringing the Confederacy to their knees, he issued Special Field Order number 15. This order confiscated a strip of land along the Atlantic coast and set it aside for freedmen to settle. The land stretched from Charleston, South Carolina, to the St. Johns River in Florida, and included Georgia's Sea Islands and the mainland 30 miles inland. The order also called for the redistribution of confiscated Southern land to freedmen in 40-acre plots. I'm sure you're all familiar with the term 40 acres and a mule. Well, that 40 acres and a mule came from Sherman's Special Field Order number 15. However, the order was rescinded later that year, and much of the land was returned to its original white owners. Within 6 months, 40,000 people who had been enslaved lived on 40,000 acres of coastal land. 400,000 acres of coastal land. So you had 40,000 people living on 400,000 acres. They used their skills and labor to make the land productive. They also set up their own civic and educational institutions. They established their own militia to protect themselves from the Ku Klux Klan. Less than a year after Sherman's order, President Andrew Johnson intervened and ordered that the vast majority of confiscated land be returned to the former owners. This included most of the land that the freedmen had settled. The federal government dispossessed tens of thousands of black landowners in Georgia and South Carolina. Some blacks fought back, driving away former owners with guns. Federal troops sometimes evicted blacks by force. So, why is this important when we're talking about generational wealth? Well, what if these people had been allowed to keep that land? 40 acres. Now, 40 acres in an acre of land in 1865 was worth about $40. If you have 40 acres, that land was worth about $1,600. Now, there were 2.2 million freedmen in the South. So if every freed slave had received that 40 acres and a mule, and if they had been allowed to keep that 40 acres and pass that 40 acres down from generation to generation, I mean, think about what sits on that land today. Maybe some type of commercial development, apartments, maybe mixed use properties, residential, commercial. Imagine what's sitting on that property right now. Maybe a few stadiums where the NFL plays or Major League Baseball. Think about what's sitting on that land today. So, what is that land worth in $2,024? Well, you simply multiply 40 acres times 2.2 million freed slaves. The value of that land is right around $380 billion. That's billion with a B. So in other words, that's $380 billion of generational wealth that was taken away. That's what it would be worth today. Think about what that would do to our community in terms of generational wealth. Think about it. If we had $380 billion in commercial real estate or agricultural real estate. So that's what that land is worth in today's dollars. So that's Sherman's Special Field Order number 15. So let's talk about the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau was set up during Reconstruction. It was a government agency established in 1865 to help newly freed African Americans, and this part caught me by surprise. Poor white Southerners transitioned to freedom and citizenship. So the Freedmen's Bureau wasn't just for African Americans. Poor white Southerners benefited from the Freedmen's Bureau as well. The Bureau's formal name was the U.S. Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, and it operated from 1865 to 1872. The Freedmen's Bureau provided food, clothing, housing, medical care, and education. It also helped freed people establish schools, purchase land, locate family members, and legalize marriages. Now, after the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau established many of our historically Black colleges and universities, also known as HBCUs, including Howard University in Washington, D.C. The National Land Grant Colleges Act of 1890 facilitated the establishment of public land grant historically Black colleges and universities. The Bureau was led by Union Army General Oliver Otis Howard, for which Howard University is named. However, some say the Bureau failed to make progress towards racial equality due to a fight between Congress and the president, as well as poor funding. So the Freedmen's Bureau was set up with the best of intentions. Some progress was made, but again, the question that I asked earlier, what if Reconstruction had been allowed? What if the powers that be had allowed Reconstruction to run its natural course? How much further ahead would we be as a people if the federal government had kept its promise and kept the Freedmen's Bureau in place and kept Reconstruction in place to where freedmen could live free and be prosperous in a newly united United States of America. So we talked about Sherman's order. We talked about the Freedmen's Bureau. Let's talk about the Compromise of 1877 and the end of Reconstruction. Now, I did a deep dive into the compromise. And remember, I think I mentioned this last week. Anytime you hear the word compromise, someone is getting the short end of the stick. And we all know who that was. It was freed slaves. Okay. The Compromise of 1877, also known as the Wormley Agreement or the Bargain of 1877, was an unwritten political deal in the United States to settle the intense dispute over the results of the 1876 presidential election. So it wasn't about prosperity. It wasn't about generational wealth. There was an election dispute. And so the results of that presidential election were being contested. And there was a filibuster. And the filibuster was ended by the Compromise of 1877. So the 1876 presidential election, the Compromise of 1877 ended the filibuster of the certified results and the threat of political violence. Well, and you thought January 6th was the first time we had to deal with political violence. This was 1876. The country was 100 years old, and there was a contested presidential election. Now, so the South said, if you end Reconstruction, we'll approve these election results. So the 5 points of the compromise were as follows. A, the removal of all remaining U.S. military forces from the former Confederate states. At the time, U.S. troops remained only in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, but the compromise completed their withdrawal from the region. Once U.S. forces were withdrawn from the former Confederacy, that left freedmen, freed women, and freed children at the mercy of the former Confederacy. Point B of the compromise, the appointment of at least one Southern Democrat to the cabinet of the newly elected president, Rutherford B. Hayes. C, the construction of another transcontinental railroad using the Texas and Pacific in the South, part of the Scott Plan, proposed by Thomas Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad, who initiated negotiations resulting in the final compromise. So it sounds like Mr. Scott was going to prosper as a result of the Compromise of 1877. So the Texas and Pacific Railroad, they said, we need to build another transcontinental railroad in the former Confederacy. So I want that. Item C, the construction of I mentioned that already. Let's go to D. Legislation to industrialize the South and restore its economy following the Civil War and Reconstruction. And finally, the 5th point, the right to deal with Black people without Northern interference. I think the 5th point of that compromise was the death blow to Reconstruction. The right to deal with Black people without Northern interference. So, thanks to President Rutherford Hayes, the newly freed slaves were left at the mercy of the former Confederacy. And eventually that led to violence against the freed slaves, a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, and basically it was business as usual in the former Confederacy without the protection of the federal government. Which brings us to today. When we're talking about generational wealth, I've highlighted some of the obstacles that were put in place by public policy, not by any one individual, not by the private sector, but presidents and congressmen and other politicians deliberately put these obstacles in our path, which is why in 2024, the wealth gap is huge between African Americans and European Americans. So today we talked about Sherman's Special Field Order number 15, the Freedmen's Bureau, and the Compromise of 1877, and the end of Reconstruction. So next week we're gonna do a deep dive into the golden age of Black capitalism. I want to thank El Paso Black Voice for giving us this forum. I want to thank Monica Tucker, my producer. Make sure you tune into other podcasts on this forum, Suite 915, Curtis Smith, and Real Talk by Marcus McCoy. Until next time, be kind to yourselves and to one another. Stay informed. And I want to thank you once again for tuning in. You all have an incredible weekend, and we'll see you next time.